Please listen for the word of God from Luke chapter 9. Now, about 8 days after these sayings, Jesus took with him Peter and John and James and went up to the mountains to pray. And while he was praying, the appearance of his face changed, and his clothes became dazzling white. Suddenly, they saw two men, Moses and Elijah, talking to him. They appeared in the glory and were speaking of his departure, which he was about to accomplish in Jerusalem. Now, Peter and his companions were weighed down with sleep, but since they had stayed awake, they saw his glory and the two men who stood with him. Just as they were leaving him, Peter said to Jesus, "Master, it is good for us to be here. Let us make 3 dwellings, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah," not knowing what he had said. While he was saying this, a cloud came and overshadowed them, and they were terrified as they entered the cloud. Then from the cloud came a voice that said, "This is my son, my chosen. Listen to him." When the voice had spoken, Jesus was found alone, and they kept silent, and in those days told no one of the things they had seen. The word of God. Please be seated. So we live in a world with cell phones, and what do cell phones do best? They're not for calling because we don't speak to each other on phones anymore. Any of you prefer texting over phone calls? Some of us are maybe old school still. The best thing about a phone is you can take pictures with it now, right? And we memorialize our lives by taking 60,000 pictures a year that is uploaded to Google Photos or iCloud. How many of you have more than 20,000 photos in your library right now? Please be honest, you're in church. 90% of you are lying. We have these devices which are incredible transformation in our world, but we have this ability to take pictures, and we just take picture after picture after picture. Some of you still remember the days when you had film, right? And you had to make sure you take a good picture, and you had no idea what it would turn out like. And you would wait for, drop it off at the pharmacy or wherever, and a couple days later, maybe you get your pictures back. We live in a world where we can instantly memorialize the things that are happening in our lives. And of course, we have social media on which we can go to share it for everybody to enjoy or contribute to our depression. The first selfie was taken in 1839 by this gentleman called Robert Cornelius. It's the first known selfie we are aware of. He took the old-fashioned camera and ran to take his own picture. One of the more famous selfies is from 1966 by Buzz Aldrin, who we all know as the person who took the steps on the moon. But in fact, before that mission was one mission prior, Buzz Aldrin went on the NASA Gemini 12 mission, where they were seeing if they could be outside of the space shuttle, and they were, and he was able to memorialize that picture. We all are familiar with the term FOMO, fear of missing out. We post selfies so that we can convince ourselves that we are not missing out, and then others see it, and then they feel like they're missing out. We tend to want to memorialize and capture our lives for everyone to see. In fact, to our own detriment. In the next picture, you see a slide of Taft Point in Yosemite, where several people have fallen to their death trying to take selfies to memorialize and capture the awe of this beautiful thing that could not exist without me in it. In fact, according to Wikipedia at least, over 450 deaths since 2011, when selfies kind of had an uptick, till today, for people trying to capture beautiful moments and memorialize themselves at these awe-inspiring nature places. There's a BBC article a while ago by Professor Linda Henkel, professor of psychology. And the research, she said, suggests that taking photos or pictures can actually impair our ability to recall details of that said picture later, despite or most likely because of the effort spent taking excessive photographs. Everybody still has 60,000 pictures in your library? We try to digitally memorialize our experiences. And here in Scripture, we find the same thing happening in what we call the Transfiguration, a moment that is trying to capture this dazzling, dizzying experience. Luke 9 verse 28 says, "Now about 8 days after these sayings, Jesus took with him Peter and John and James and went up to the mountain to pray. And while he was praying, the appearance of his face changed and his clothes became dazzling white. Suddenly they saw two men, Moses and Elijah, talking to him. They appeared in glory and were speaking of his departure, which he was about to accomplish in Jerusalem. Now Peter and his companions were weighed down with sleep, but since they had stayed awake, they saw his glory and the two men who stood with him." And so here we have this beautiful painting by Raphael that painted these three figures, the three disciples, James, Peter, and John, and then Jesus in dazzling glory and next to him Moses and Elijah. This dazzling, dizzying experience that Peter wants to memorialize. Because it says in verse 33, just as they were leaving him, Peter said to Jesus, "Master, it is good for us to be here. So let us make 3 dwellings, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah." And the Gospel of Luke adds, Peter didn't have a clue what he was saying. Here we have a dizzying, dazzling experience happen, and Peter wants to memorialize it with a selfie-like dwelling for Moses and Elijah and Jesus and capture this moment so that he can have it forever. Now, there are 2 ways we can look at Peter's response here. The first is we can be optimistic about how Peter is behaving here. Maybe Peter is not really foolish, but simply awestruck, and he has this deep desire to celebrate Jesus. The passage before, when Jesus asked him, "Peter, but who do you say I am?" Peter boldly answers, "You are the Messiah." So he saw Jesus now in his glory and thought, okay, Jesus is the Messiah. I want to hold on to that. Let's build a home. That's maybe the more optimistic way of looking at Peter here. The more pessimistic way of looking at this would be to see that Peter is trying to secure in place, if not even tie down and domesticate the wild spirit of God's kingdom. Peter sees that glory. He wants to capture it, contain it, and even control it. Let's build dwellings for each of you. Let's nail down this moment. Let's take that selfie and preserve it for all times. Because as human beings, we are meaning seekers. And when confronted with these dizzying, dazzling experiences, we want to memorialize it. We want to hang on to it and our brush with a moment of glory. And so we attempt to preserve the moment and we settle in that moment. We tend to make that moment the norm. We always wanted to be this way, Peter says. When we experience something of God that brings us joy or comfort or sits easy on our lives, we want to take that experience with God, capture it, and contain it so that it becomes the standard experience with God. And when we settle like this, we often like to settle it for everyone else also. My mountaintop experience with God needs to be your mountaintop experience with God. And when we do this, it becomes more about my God than the God of the Scriptures. We take our view of God, freeze frame it, and in this way we box God. And in some ways, we then make God into our image rather than being in the image of God. As humans, we tend to want to preserve a moment, memorialize it, and settle. But you see, disciples of Jesus are pilgrims, not settlers. Disciples of Jesus are pilgrims on the move. Peter was so caught up in the vision that he failed to understand that transfiguration is a journey and not a static moment. Disciples of Jesus are pilgrims on the move, not settlers who are static. Peter was so focused on what he sees that he does not hear the conversation between Jesus and his two guests. He does not hear, he does not understand, he only looks. If he was listening carefully to the conversation between Moses and Elijah and Jesus, this is what he would have heard, verse 30 to 31. Suddenly they saw two men, Moses and Elijah, talking to him. Peter only sees, he needs to listen. They appeared in glory and were speaking of his departure, which he was about to accomplish at Jerusalem. Departure, a word about motion, not static. In fact, this Greek word for departure is literally translated as exodus. So when we read this verse, we should read it like this. Suddenly they saw two men, Moses and Elijah, talk to him. They appeared in glory and were speaking of Jesus' exodus, which he was about to accomplish in Jerusalem. Now, a few verses earlier, Jesus told the disciples that he must suffer, he must be rejected, killed, and then raised to life. And Peter, like we had just said, exclaimed, "You are the Messiah." But now it seems that Peter and the others are not so keen on these recent words of Jesus about motion and departure and exodus to and through Jerusalem. They're not so excited about suffering and death anymore. They're understandably hoping for a deliverance from and maybe even triumph over their enemies, the Romans, maybe with a little side of revenge thrown in there. So when Peter sees this dazzling display of glory, he wants to freeze frame this experience, wrap it up, tie it in a bow, and settle. But Luke tells us that Jesus is on a journey. Jesus is on an exodus to and through the cross. I love how Fred Craddock talks about this passage. He says, "From the Mount of Transfiguration stretches the way of Jesus, a journey of liberation from what oppresses us, a journey from what we know into something unknown, across the sea of chaos into new creation, a journey of death and new life. Jesus' exodus is fraught with pain, rejection, and death." And Craddock says, this is a mountaintop experience, but not the kind about which you write glowingly of sunrises, soft breezes, warm friends, music, and quiet time. No, on this mountain, the subject is death. This moment of dazzling glory comes not at the end of the gospel, but right in the middle of Jesus' journey towards the cross. This transfiguration is not the climactic moment in which Jesus' true nature is decisively revealed for all to see. That happens at the cross. In fact, in the Gospel of Luke, this transfiguration is the pivot point, the turning point in the Gospel of Luke. Up to this point, Jesus is in his Galilean ministry, teaching and healing. But after this transfiguration experience, Jesus turns his face towards Jerusalem, as the Gospel of Luke says, and makes his way to the cross. The transfiguration is not the climax of the gospel, but the pivot point leading to the cross. See, transfigurations aren't exits. Transfigurations aren't final destinations. Transfigurations are exoduses. On the mountaintop, Jesus has not arrived. He is on his way. Jesus is a pilgrim to the cross, not a settler on the mountaintop. And disciples, just like Jesus, are on a journey. We don't settle. Of course, what did we do? We built a church there. Peter ended up getting his way, because our human nature is to mostly end up settling. At least we have the comfort and perhaps the correction that the Bible reports that Peter did not have a clue what he was saying. Thank goodness for Peter. The gospel continues in verse 34. While he was saying this, a cloud came and overshadowed them, and they were terrified as they entered into this cloud. Then from the cloud came a voice that said, "This is my son, my chosen. Listen to him." And when the voice had spoken, Jesus was found alone, and they kept silent, and in those days told no one of any of the things that they'd seen. See, just as quickly as this vision appears, it's over. But not before there is a word from God and a simple instruction which says, "This is my son, listen to him." Peter got the whole picture wrong, so God directs him to listen. See, Peter got it all wrong. He zoomed in onto this one experience that made it the whole. He zoomed into this dazzling display of glory. He zoomed into only this part and made that the whole. He was so focused and zoomed in that he completely forgot about the rest of the picture. Because you see, the Transfiguration story continues. Because Transfigurations aren't static, it's movement, it's Exodus. And in all three Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, after the Transfiguration, they have this very same story in all three Gospel accounts. Verse 37 continues, on the next day, when they had come down from the mountain, from this dazzling display of glory, when they'd come down from the mountain, a crowd gathered to meet him. Just then, a man from the crowd shouted, "Teacher, I beg you to look at my son. He's my only child." Suddenly a spirit seizes him, and all at once he shrieks. It throws him into convulsions until foam is at the mouth. It mauls him and will scarcely leave him. I begged your disciples to cast it out, but they could not. Jesus answered, "You faithless and perverse generation. How much longer must I be with you and bear with you? Bring your son here." While he was coming, the demon dashed him to the ground in convulsions. But Jesus rebuked the unclean spirit, healed the boy, and gave him back to the father. And all were astounded at the greatness of God. See, there is more to this picture than just what Peter had focused on. Peter only focused on Jesus, Moses, and Elijah. He was so zoomed in on the mountain that he forgot about the valley. It is human nature to want to zoom in and to focus in on the things that bring us comfort, that make us feel good, that help us to settle. Even to the point where we believe this is the whole. Kind of like Instagram. Here are a couple of examples of Instagram people trying to make one zoomed part the whole. Because as we post things, we curate our mountaintop experiences. You can go through the slides, Ruben. There you have a beautiful garden, but you see the mess of everything here. And the next one, we see a beautiful picture with no people in it, but we're in the middle of the park where people are around and messing up our picture. Next one. Here you have a wonderful food, but you've got the ramen noodles you're actually eating in the bottom. Next one. In the beautiful picture of the city, but we miss all of the technology and the cables and towers that are there. Next one. Oh, what a beautiful yoga pose. I can't even do it by myself. Somebody needs to hold me up for that picture. And I'm sitting at the beach. How wonderful. Look at this beautiful, pristine beach that I have all to myself, except for the people around me. See, Peter zoomed in on the whole part. If Peter had an Instagram account, this is what his snapshot would look like. Oh, next one. Oh, this one, actually. Yes, there you go. Instead, this is the reality. Peter zoomed in on the Transfiguration experience that he forgot about the valley below. And he curated his mountaintop experience, wanting to build 3 buildings to make his clean Instagram post for everybody to see that he's got it. But the reality is he did not look at the full picture. If you zoom in on the bottom of this painting by Raphael, you'll see that he paints the Transfiguration and the healing of the boy as one scene, like it is found in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. It is one picture, one account, one story. You cannot separate the Transfiguration from the healing of the boy in the valley. Because faithfulness is not achieved by freezing a moment. No, faithfulness follows God in trust towards the future. Jesus does not linger in the dazzling wonder of the Transfiguration. He keeps moving down to the valley and to the cross. At the Transfiguration, Jesus learns perhaps for the first time that there's more to him than what he has known, and yet he remains compassionate about our human mess. He does not abandon us for happier days with Moses and Elijah. Jesus returns to our confusions and our lost lives, leading us to discover who we can become and when we try to be faithful rather than wanting to be happy in our transfigurations all the time. See, there's danger that we settle in moments of God's blessing, and by doing so, avoiding the ongoing cross-carrying journey of transfiguration that is the life of a disciple. We have choices about how we respond to our mountaintop transfiguration events in our lives. We can ruin them with if-onlys. If only I could stay here longer. If only things would not change. If only I could relive that experience. We can reminisce about our experience, caressing and massaging them, even as an excuse to disengage from the world. Or we can allow them to prepare us for what God is calling us to next. What does God call Jesus to next? To the valley below. To the way of death and suffering. There are two beloved sons in this story. A beloved son who is chosen one, the one who is going on an exodus, the one we listen to, the one who is dazzling in glory. And there's another beloved son, a father's only son, captive to evil spirits and disease. And Jesus, the chosen son, leaves the glory of his mountaintop to bring glory to the suffering son. Jesus is not selfish. Jesus is selfless. Jesus does not settle. Jesus is on the move. Jesus does not come to lift people up to a higher mountaintop experiences. Rather, the mountaintop experiences enable us to understand the God of the dust down here where life in the valley happens. Friends, the Christian life is full of mountaintop experiences. It's tempting to want our religious journey to be made solely of these beautiful transfiguration moments, bypassing the chaos, the challenges, the struggle. In our mountaintop moments, something inside of us cries out, "It is good for us to be here. Let's build this building to capture it. Let's bask in this glory together. Let's build our lives around this moment." There is a saying that says, life is not measured by the number of breaths you take, but the moments that take your breath away. And this is true to some degree. But it is also true that life, especially Christian life, continually calls us down from those breathtaking moments, down from the mountaintop. We are called to descend from our moments of profound glory, celebration, and joy into the ordinariness of the valleys of this world where life is messy and challenging, but oh, so beautiful. We want to memorialize, freeze frame. Peter wants to capture this moment with a selfie and a two-dimensional flattened picture and hold on to that as his experience. I'm going to share with you a portion of a TED Talk by Cesar Kuriyama, who created eventually an app called 1 Second a Day. But he talks here about the difference between freeze frame and video in motion. Let's listen.
So the first of those projects ended up being something I called 1 Second Every Day. Basically, I'm recording 1 second of every day of my life for the rest of my life. chronologically compiling these 1 second tiny slices of my life into one single continuous video until, I can't record them anymore. The purpose of this project is, one, I hate not remembering things that I've done in the past. There's all these things that I've done with my life that I have no recollection of, unless someone brings it up, and sometimes I think, oh yeah, that's something that I, did. And something that I realized early on in the project was that if I wasn't doing anything interesting, I would probably forget to record the video. This has really invigorated me day to day when I wake up to try and do something interesting with my day. It's also kind of a personal protest against the culture we have now where people just are at concerts with their cell phones out recording the whole concert and they're disturbing you. They're not even enjoying the show, they're watching the concert through their cell phone. I hate that. I admittedly used to be that guy a little bit back in the day, and I've decided that the best way for me to still capture and keep a visual memory of my life and not be that person is to just record that 1 second that will allow me to trigger that memory of, yeah, that concert was amazing. I really loved that concert. This really tragic thing happened where my sister-in-law, her intestines suddenly strangled one day. And we took her to the emergency room, and she was in really bad shape. We almost lost her a couple of times, and I was there with my brother every day, and it helped me realize something else during this project is that recording that 1 second on a really bad day is extremely difficult. It's not. We tend to take our cameras out when we're doing awesome things, or oh yeah, this party, let me take a picture. But we rarely do that when we're having a bad day and something horrible is happening. And I found that it's actually been very, very important to record even just that 1 second of a really bad moment. Now, one of the things that I do is I don't use any filters. I don't use anything I try to capture the moment as much as possible as the way that I saw it with my own eyes. I started a rule of first-person perspective. Early on, I think I had a couple of videos where I would, you see me in it, but I realized that wasn't the way to go. The way to really remember what I saw was to record it as I actually saw it. Now, a couple of things that I have in my head about this project are, wouldn't it be interesting if thousands of people were doing this? I think it would be interesting to see what everyone did with a project like this. I think everyone would have a different interpretation of it. I think everyone would benefit from just having that 1 second to remember every day. I never want to forget another day that I've ever lived, and this is my way of doing that. And it'd be really interesting also to see if you could just type in on a website like June 18th, 2018, and you would just see a stream of people's lives on that particular day from all over the world. And I don't know, I think this project has a lot of possibilities, and I encourage you all to record just a small snippet of your life every day so you can never forget it that day you lived. Thank you.
Isn't that interesting? The difference between a freeze frame selfie and a 1 second video. Take 1 second, put it away, and bask in the experience, and then move on. Transfigurations aren't exits. It's not static. Transfigurations are about movement and about pilgrims following the way of Jesus. From the mountaintop, through the valleys, to and through the cross, to the resurrection, and then repeat. So friends, let's not settle. Let's not stay on our mountaintops. Let's have transfigurations, moving with the God who is on the move, exodusing to and through the cross to the glory of God. Amen.